On Saturday, senior ICE officials received instructions from the White House to ramp up deportations. They were told they had new quotas to hit. Each of the agency's field offices should arrest 75 people every day. The target would be 12 or 1,500 people total every day nationwide. The reason they were given? President Trump felt like in the first week or so of his second administration, deportations were happening too slowly. From the newsroom of The Washington Post, this is Post Reports. I'm Martine Powers. It's Monday, January 27th. Today, we hear from immigration reporter Nick Miroff about the Trump administration's plan to rapidly ramp up deportations and what obstacles it might face. So, Nick, tell me more about these quotas that were communicated on Saturday. Like, what exactly are they directing ICE officials to do?
Well, let's remember that President Trump has promised to deport millions of criminals, as he has said, and he has promised the largest mass deportation operation in U.S. history.
I will rescue every city and town that has been invaded and conquered, and we will put these vicious and bloodthirsty criminals in jail or kick them the hell out of our country and fast.
And so what we've seen over the course of the first early days of his administration is the number of people taken into custody by ICE has slowly climbed from about 300 during Trump's first day in office to more than 900 on Sunday. And that is by far the largest number of people arrested by ICE that I can remember in a single day. We should also keep in mind, though, that if you are going to try to deport 1 million people in 1 year, you would have to arrest at least 2,700 people a day. So even with those much more intense and aggressive operations by ICE, it's still not going to get them the kinds of lofty numbers that Trump has promised. And so despite the fact that he has been told by DHS officials over the course of his political career that a lot of his ambitions are not realistic, and this is one of those cases, he really wants, then the White House really want to see much more aggressive deployment by ICE across the country.
And that's why they have put out this quota now of 1,200 to 1,500 people per day. What exactly does that look like? Like, if they're told this is what we expect you to do every day from this point forward, what does that entail?
Well, what's different is starting this week, they are enlisting other federal law enforcement agencies to go out with ICE teams on the streets to help make these arrests. And that includes various Department of Justice agencies, including the FBI. FBI agents, alcohol, tobacco, firearms and explosives agents, DEA agents, U.S. Marshals, Federal Bureau of Prisons officers. All of these folks are now being enlisted to help ICE officers go out and look for these targets on their lists and then take other people into custody who they find with those targets.
I mean, that makes sense from the perspective of if you're trying to get to the point of deporting millions of people in a year, that you would need more manpower. But I wonder, I mean, these are federal agents who have other jobs to do and theoretically like other crimes that they're trying to investigate or prevent from happening. Like, is there pushback on the idea of using other parts of law enforcement to do this job? And questions around like what's being sacrificed in order for Trump to be able to carry out this mass deportation plan?
Yes, I think those are all questions that are being asked this morning as we speak, as you see agents who are responsible for stopping drug trafficking and child exploitation cases and all of these things. All of them are being diverted to this immigration enforcement and mass deportation mission. I mean, what we're seeing is the entire, federal government apparatus being focused on this one goal that the president set out on the campaign trail.
And where have arrests taken place so far? When you think about those numbers ramping up throughout the past week, up to more than 900, as you said on Sunday, where is that happening?
Well, as we discussed, they're telling every field office to come up with 75 arrests per day. So they're happening nationwide. That said, they are also launching what they're calling special targeted operations. And the first one kicked off yesterday in Chicago.
What is a special targeted operation?
These are the operations that involve more federal agents and are seeking an even larger number of arrests. And we can expect sanctuary cities in particular appear to be, in the sights of these deployments.
And in communicating all of this to the public, the White House border czar, Tom Homan, he was actually on TV on Sunday. He was on ABC News talking about kind of the beginning stages of this intended mass deportation plan. And let's just listen to a little bit of him talking about the current situation right now.
You're going to see the number steadily increase, the number of arrests nationwide as we open up the aperture. Right now it's concentrating public safety threats, national security threats. That's a smaller population. So we're going to do this on priority base, as President Trump's promised, but as that aperture opens, there'll be more arrests nationwide.
Tell me more about what we're hearing here. Like, how is Homan and how are other members of the Trump administration making the case for this?
Well, I think it's important to keep in mind that this is a mass enforcement operation, but also a mass communications operation. And Tom Homan, Trump's handpicked border czar, has been the face of what this, what the White House is trying to do. And what he's talking about is addressing concerns that they're going to go through cities and do sweeps and roundups. And he has explicitly said that that is not the way ICE is operating, and that's not the way that these broader teams that are now involving Department of Justice officers and agents are going to operate. And so what they're doing is they're going out with target lists, right? People who they want to take into custody. He says they're prioritizing criminals and people who are public safety threats. As we know, sometimes people with criminal records or charges, those charges can include things like immigration violations or other nonviolent felonies, but they also do include people with, suspected violent crimes or things like drunk driving, that type of thing. And so they are looking for those folks, and when they go to an address, they will look for that individual, but they will also question anyone they suspect of being in the country illegally. And that is how they get to larger numbers of arrests and take into custody people who may not have criminal charges on their records at all. Mm-hmm. And when Homan says we're widening the aperture, that is what he's getting at. He says that, even if they're going to start with criminals, they're going to consider anybody who is in the country without legal status to basically be fair game for arrest.
Interesting. So when you hear Homan say that, we're focusing on public safety threats, national security threats, that might be their intended target if you take them at their word, but there are people who are currently being arrested and who we expect will be arrested in coming days or weeks who will not be people who have committed crimes who are also getting caught up in this.
Yeah, let's say they go to an apartment building in Chicago, for example, looking for somebody with a criminal charge on their record. They knock on that door. That person is not there, but then they question the person they're speaking to. They get access to the dwelling or to the hallway. They may encounter other people who cannot prove that they're in the country legally, and they end up with the 3 or 4 or even more arrests in that apartment building, even though initially they started out looking for a criminal suspect.
And thinking about some of the scenarios you've outlined, what kind of impact has this had on immigrant communities who are hearing about what's going on, hearing about other communities where arrests have already taken place or plans for that to happen in the future? Like, what's going through their minds?
Well, I think we're starting to see some of that fear and panic spread across the country. There was the incident in Chicago last week when a school thought that ICE had come knocking on the door. It turned out to be the Secret Service doing something completely unrelated to immigration enforcement. But it was an example of the kind of alarm that we're already starting to see and we'll see more of. There are anecdotal reports of people not showing up for work, farm workers not showing up to work, construction sites that don't have workers all of a sudden. Will we see more of that? I think we can expect that will happen. And then there's a much larger pool of people who are in some state of their immigration court process that have regular appointments with ICE, who go check in with ICE and show that they are, otherwise, living and working peacefully and don't have any criminal problems and that type of thing. Well, ICE is now taking those people into custody when they come for their appointments. And so I think we're going to see that type of voluntary compliance with, with ICE monitoring, ICE case monitoring, we're going to see that start to go down too as more people go underground and take extraordinary steps to avoid contact with federal officers.
Wow. I mean, I can imagine that just leaves people in such a difficult position in terms of, I want to be here legally. I want to start a process to be able to make the case for why I should be able to stay in the U.S. and follow the rules of what that could look like. But that if I go and show up for this appointment that they told me to show up for, then I could be deported immediately. And maybe, quote unquote, following the rules is going to hurt people.
Yeah, those are the kinds of choices that I think people are going to be struggling with over the coming weeks and months.
Let me ask this. How is this process different from how the U.S. government has deported people in the past or deported people, up until a week ago, right? It's not like people were not being deported from this country until Trump became president again. And so, how is the way that they're carrying this out different from the usual process of conducting deportations?
That's a great question, Martina. And we should keep in mind that last year, the Biden administration, for example, deported 271,000 people, and that was the highest level in 10 years. Most of those people were arrested after crossing the southern border. What's different now is that Trump and the Trump administration are going into U.S. cities and communities to try to carry out this campaign. And under President Biden, ICE had been given guidelines that essentially limited these types of operations. Their focus under Biden was also public safety, national security threats, and recent border crossers. And so ICE teams were going out under Biden and doing this type of work. They have always done this type of work. That is what they do. What they were given was instructions to be more cautious and discreet about how they operate and to be more targeted in who they go after. And so the types of arrests that I was describing, in which they show up at a location and end up taking other people into custody who weren't their original target, those collateral arrests were generally discouraged under the Biden administration. The Biden administration was not doing the kinds of mass worksite enforcement raids that Trump has talked about doing. And most importantly, the Biden administration gave ICE agents, guidance on what they call sensitive locations, to not take people into custody or look to make arrests in churches, schools, hospitals, these types of places that, can both be incredibly disruptive but also produce the kind of public backlash that Tom Homan, and for one, is aware of as a risk. And that's one of the reasons you see him really trying to lean into the criminality of the people they're going after.
What criminals are hiding in schools? Middle schools, elementary schools. You going to go into those?
How many MS-13 members are at age 14 to 17? Many of them. So, look, if it's a national security threat, public safety threat, and what you need to understand is a case by case.
As we have seen over time, over multiple administrations, once the public starts seeing what immigration enforcement really looks like, especially if it appears to be indiscriminate, there's a growing public backlash.
After the break, we'll hear more about that public backlash and why some Democratic lawmakers are more hesitant to voice opposition. We'll be right back.
My name is Michelle Singletary, and I'm the personal finance columnist for The Washington Post. When I was growing up, I was raised by my grandmother, who was such a masterful money manager. And I watched her handle her money and talk to me about it. And I like to think that I'm the reader's big mama. There's so much information about your money out there, a lot of it wrong or inappropriate. But when you pay for a subscription to the Post, you're paying for a skilled journalist who has had years of experience, who I hope that you can trust. Your subscription helps pay for my salary. It helps pay for the illustrators, the copy editors, all the people who are involved in putting together the material that you read that could help inform your life. I'm Michelle Singletary, and I'm one of the people behind the Post.
So, Nick, tell me more about the pushback that we've heard so far from how this plan is being carried out. And as you describe it, this reality we have now where even if if immigration officials are targeting people who have committed crimes, that collateral arrests are not discouraged the way they were under the Biden administration, but it sounds like in some ways encouraged to get to these quota numbers.
Yeah, I think it's going to be very hard for ICE officers to meet these quotas without casting a much wider net than they have been until now. What I'm seeing so far is that communities and the broader federal government, people are just sort of in shock right now. That is what the White House was going for. They have tried to, really overwhelm, both, I think, federal agencies as well as their political opponents with this burst of orders and directives and operations. And so I think people are really struggling to adjust to that. And that's one of the reasons we're seeing so many reports of rumored ICE activity in communities all across the country. It's going to be a question of over the next weeks and months, what the opposition to that starts to look like and whether it can be effective.
And obviously, a lot of that opposition comes in the form of people saying, look, we think this is wrong. We think that this is causing unnecessary fear and panic, that you are, getting the wrong people in the way that you are carrying out these deportation efforts. But in terms of the challenges that are facing this plan, even from people who want to carry it out, can you talk about what are some of the logistical problems that might prevent this mass deportation plan from being carried out in the way that Trump or Homan or other people in the Trump administration are imagining?
Sure. I mean, one of the things that's really fascinating to observe is that the ambitions of this kind of operation have outpaced the logistical and financial resources of ICE itself. I mean, that is one reason we're seeing all these other federal agencies being enlisted to help.
That it's like a manpower issue in some ways.
It's a staffing issue, but then if you go beyond the staffing issue, then you really get into some infrastructural limitations. And that is, for example, ICE has about 40,000 beds available per day for detainees, right? So it can hold only about 40,000 people on any given day. That's what it's funded for. And so what they are talking about, what the Trump administration is looking for, is to more than double that, to be able to hold at least 100,000 people. And so they're planning to build temporary camp sites, temporary detention centers. We're only beginning to see the outlines of that plan starting to take shape. And all of that, of course, is going to depend on funding. I should say, what I think we've all observed is that the politics of immigration enforcement have shifted in Trump's favor, right?
Say more about that.
They have shifted over the past few years. President Biden had record numbers of illegal border crossings during his term. We saw that become a huge political liability for him, even for Vice President Harris along the campaign trail.
We have a historic immigration crisis because Kamala Harris started and said that she wanted to undo all of Donald Trump's border policies. 94 executive orders suspending deportations, decriminalizing illegal aliens, massively increasing the asylum fraud that exists in our system. That has opened the floodgates.
Even as border crossings fell to the lowest points in more than 4 years over the last few months. So the fact that so many people came into the United States, that there was this big strain that everyone read about in cities like New York and Chicago, has created more political space for the Trump administration to push these kinds of measures and made it harder for a lot of Democrats to push back. Now, what Democrats are saying is that we're not opposed to going after criminals and gang members and things like that. We've always supported that. What we don't want is the kind of indiscriminate, enforcement that we're, fearing is starting to happen.
That's really interesting and touches on something that we heard a little bit on some of our conversations on the podcast last week, this question of where are Democrats going to come down on this? Because obviously the look of, families being broken up and sort of the heartbreak of seeing something like mass deportation. I mean, I think a lot of Democrats feel very opposed to that. But at the same time, as you say, there's this new political liability, or Democrats have also started to shift toward the right on immigration, or the sense of maybe more enforcement is needed. And so how are they going to navigate that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Democrats are trying to stake out a position that says we want, and I'm not talking about all Democrats, but some of the centrist Democrats that have joined the Trump administration, or at least partially supporting some of his initiatives, they're saying that, we want the border to be under control. We want a secure border. And we also want ICE to be able to take into custody and deport criminals. When it gets beyond that, then you come into some real political values questions that the country broadly struggles with, which is, if somebody comes into the United States illegally and is working hard and doesn't have documentation, but is otherwise following the rules, should they be allowed to stay in this country? And I think, people in Trump's movement come down very firmly on the side of them not being here and should not be able to work. But as we all know, a huge part of our economy is dependent on the labor of folks like that. And the labor shortages of the past years since the pandemic have drawn a lot more laborers of that kind to the United States who are otherwise working and living quietly in their communities and now are going to be potentially targeted for this type of enforcement.
And in terms of pushback, one thing that we're already seeing is other countries raising questions about how these deportations are taking place and basically saying, look, the way that you're sending people back to us, we don't think it's right. Or we saw that with Colombia over the weekend. Can you explain briefly, what happened between the Trump administration and Colombia and how that shed some light on some of the other hurdles that this plan is facing?
Yeah, what we've seen pushback to is the use of military C-17 transport planes for deportation flights. ICE typically uses charter aircraft, regular passenger aircraft. But, this last week, the Trump administration very, visibly, I think, wanted to send a signal by using the military and its assets to turn this into kind of like a military operation. And that, the optics of that are complicated in Latin America. And, we saw Mexico push back on the Trump administration's plan to do that to Mexico. And then the president of Colombia said that the Trump administration couldn't send 2 planes that it was planning to use.
Can I ask why? Why do other countries care what kind of plane we use to send people back on?
What the president of Colombia said and what we've seen from other Latin American presidents is that it's treating deportees like invaders, the kind of language that Trump uses, treating them like criminals and treating the deportation process as something that requires this type of military hardware, that it's kind of, insulting and undignified, that they don't view many of these migrants in the same kind of sinister terms that, Trump has depicted them. And seeing giant C-17s landing with 75 to 80 passengers only very much strikes them as an insult.
Though some of these conflicts were resolved pretty quickly, right? That there was an agreement was made about how this would be carried out going forward?
Well, last night, it was an example of the kind of lengths that Trump is willing to go to impose his will and to impose this campaign on these other countries. And, he immediately threatened to hit Colombia with tariffs that would go up to 50% and, block the visas for Colombian officials, that type of thing. And after some, diplomatic back-channeling, the Colombian president relented rather quickly. And so those flights are going to be back on.
Nick, one last question. What about the potential legal challenges to this deportation plan? That was a theme that we saw come up frequently during Trump's first term in office, is that he tried to do things and then those things were kind of held up in court as people tried to fight against them. And so here, is there a world where some of what is happening now is challenged in court? And to what extent, when we see these deportations being carried out, to what extent are they skipping steps in the process, or are the people who are being arrested in these raids, are they receiving the due process that they're entitled to?
Well, Trump has declared a national emergency, among other executive orders and actions taken on his first day. And what they are trying to do is unlock some very extraordinary powers that the executive branch has to face some kind of, invasion or emergency and be able to rapidly expel people from the country without giving them the kinds of due process that they would under normal circumstances. The legal challenges are going to, in part, revolve around whether or not, that is a legitimate use of these authorities. I think we can expect there will be challenges on those grounds, in addition to other challenges related to the way people are being arrested, the way they're being detained, the way they're being deported from the country on military cargo jets, that type of thing.
Nick, thank you so much for sharing your insights here.
Anytime. Happy to be with you.
Nick Miroff is an immigration reporter for The Post. That's it for Post Reports. Thanks for listening. If you want to show your support for the show, please subscribe to The Washington Post. Not only is it a great way to help us continue to do this work, but you can now get access to Washington Post podcasts ad-free in Apple Podcasts. Subscribe in Apple Podcasts or by following the link in our show notes. Today's show was produced by Emma Talkoff with help from Ariel Plotnick. It was edited by Maggie Penman and mixed by Sam Baer. I'm Martine Powers. We'll be back tomorrow with more stories from The Washington Post.